Hey Crowfall, it's Galvia. Decided to do a little bit of a detailed analysis of the Wildcard 2 match that happened yesterday, Sunday, May 23rd, for the ECS Tournament Championship Series for 2021. Coming at this from a bit more of a detailed perspective from a player who's actually played in Wildcards, has prepared a lot for HungerDome. Obviously, I'm a loser and didn't make it on, which is why I'm willing to share my thoughts and ideas about this. But I wanted to kind of give you guys, from a perspective of somebody who tried to play the ECS tournament relatively competitively, and what folks who are competing in this tournament, how they're viewing things, and how they're looking at these wild cards and the competitions and stuff like that are available from a bit more of a perspective of somebody who's really put in the time versus just kind of analyzing the game as it's happening, things like that. So this is going to be a bit more of a slower video where I talk a lot about boring stuff like reading the lobby and strategy and a bunch of crap like that. But we'll eventually get into actually reviewing the play and what's going on and all that stuff. But I just wanted to take some time to go over things in detail and maybe reveal a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes and how people are preparing for the tournament. So this video looks to cover mostly from a little bit of a higher level review of what's going on in these matches by looking at detailing the strategy of how people are approaching the matches, why they're picking the teams that they're picking, how they play the game in the early and mid game, and then how late game decision making in fall and winter are really influencing the outcomes of these matches, and ways that teams who are preparing for Wildcard 3 or the finals might be able to improve their game and give themselves a better chance of winning. Also, it might be useful for you as a viewer to understand a little bit more about what's going on in these areas, because it just makes the game a lot more interesting, honestly. HungerDome is the first mode in Crowfall where there's actually an opportunity for individual skill to be represented. And obviously there's a bunch of complaints about RNG and about the format of the tournament and a bunch of stuff like that. But the process of giving yourself the best opportunity to win is really interesting, and I think it's worth really a discussion. So to get started, I want to talk about strategy. The first part of strategy when it comes to these wildcards, and just for the record, I'm not going to talk about really basic stuff like targeting and a bunch of other crap like that. I'm going to be mostly talking about the metagame level of things. The most important thing to do when approaching these wildcards is to get a read on the lobby that you're playing in. At this point, everybody who's made it to wildcards has played multiple Hunger Game matches, oftentimes practicing very frequently throughout the week, and so we know what most of the teams who are involved in these wildcards are capable of. So it's very important before you making any decisions prior to the game starting, what archetypes you're picking and all the strategy and stuff. It's very important to read the lobby and see what you're working with, basically. So we're going to be using Wildcard 2 as the primary example for today's sort of review, because I think it's the most interesting one and has the most impact, but I'll also use Wildcard 1 as a reference point. In Wildcard 2, we have 12 teams. We're going to be focusing mostly on Heels on Yanni, House of Vari, Vanguard White, and Praise the Mayonnaise as the sort of main characters of our approach here. Flight Assembly also made it to Final Circle and did fairly well. But in particular, I want to focus on these teams because I think they all had kind of distinct strategies and what they wanted to do. But there's other teams obviously involved in this, and so when experienced wildcard player and experienced ECS player looks at this lobby, you can kind of pick out a couple important things. Firstly, you want to identify how many killing teams are available in the lobby. And what I mean by killing teams is I mean aggressive teams that are looking to eliminate people early, trying to take up valuable resources in a map early because they know they can take fights without risking things against the majority of the lobby. And so you kind of want to identify who those killing teams are. So to start, Vanguard White is an obvious killing team. Vanguard as a guild is extremely skilled, and most of their teams or all of their teams are extremely aggressive and quite capable of beating your ass. So this is an aggressive team. House of Vari would be what I would consider a middling aggressive team. They ended up running a secular comp, but they do have Staff and Unfolded on their team who are relatively aggressive players from my time spent playing with them. And so this is a team that would be willing to kill, however, is a little bit more passive. You also have Heels on Yanni, who are also willing to take fights, but are typically the kind of team that will take a risky fight. They're not exactly looking to die early, but they will kill people if they don't necessarily respect them. Flawed Assembly is also willing to take fights, so this is another sort of situation similar to House of Ari, where they're looking to take good fights that they think they can win or have an advantage in, but not necessarily just kill out the whole lobby. And Praise the Mayonnaise is, again, like willing to kill lesser opponents, but mostly looking to avoid. So overall, I would say the aggression level in this particular lobby is very low. Golden Vessel is the same kind of way, but all these other teams are basically unknown. Parallel Forces plays a decent amount, but aren't extremely successful, so I expect them to be more passive in their play. But overall, I would not describe this as a killing lobby. I would describe this as a more passive lobby looking to play the late game. And so with that in mind, you have to think about what you want to do when you're approaching this particular wildcard, how aggressive you want to be, how much you want to sort of favor lasting till the very end in order to give yourself a chance of winning the sort of like hunger lottery. In the most recent patch, they implemented a change where if you kill a team, like fully eliminate them off the map, you gain a 10% resistance to hunger when you're in the hunger, which is very useful in the final circle collapse because it buys you seconds of time that others wouldn't get naturally, which is super useful for killing teams and makes it a very good idea for you to go try to kill people later in the game and eliminate those teams. Gives you a huge advantage, but it's not so overwhelming of an advantage that playing something that's just trying to live isn't useful, because those killing teams are more likely to be focused because they've been spending the entire game bullying people or other matches. So again, just my sort of assessment of this lobby is that it is not aggressive, but has the capability of being aggressive. So people can kill, most of them will likely not seek that opportunity out. If you want to compare that to Wildcard 1 and how that went, there's a number of teams here, 3 teams. My team, Clutch, CG Devils, even Unparalleled would also be considered that, and I would also consider Thunder from Down Under also to be a killing team. But this is, at the very least, has 3 strong killing teams and a couple secondary sort of like willing to kill teams. Here for the Tendies also willing to fight too. So there's like plenty of teams here are looking to like scrap. And so that makes a different assessment of this lobby. This is much more aggressive. And so being aggressive yourself becomes more valuable because you might actually be able to kill one of these teams and not just die. And you'll see that these wildcards played very differently. This wildcard didn't even make it to the final collapse. Aggressive teams killed each other off before it actually fully collapsed, and we had this big sort of standing around standoff type of situation. So if you go back and look at this is a much more passive lobby, which is why we ended up with so many people at the end. This is a much more aggressive lobby, which is why we ended up with so few people in the end, and it dictated the compositions that these teams ran. And then if we look at Wildcard 3, which is coming up next weekend, and then I think the final is also next weekend, we have another situation where we have one hyper-aggressive team, Vanguard Black, and then several not very aggressive teams. Maybe greater than 0 or average Joes would be willing to do this. Drop Dead is an aggressive team, so I would consider maybe these 2 teams to be relatively aggressive, but 2 of 12 is not necessarily enough to be considered a killing lobby. These 2 teams have to do a lot of work to eliminate all these teams before they get to the final circle. So this would be another more passive lobby, I'd expect. And so these sort of evaluations will dictate what the current meta is and what people are going to be working on. So let's talk a little bit about choosing compositions and understanding your own strengths and weaknesses. Currently in HungerDome, most teams are running 1 tank, 2 DPS, and then a choice of healers, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. But primarily the most common compositions are Frostguard, Warden, and Titan, playing up to the Frostguard's shrink strength and the ability to sort of like mitigate damage and control your opponents. Fury, Titan, Warden is also relatively popular. Similar sort of idea. It buffs damage instead of reduces damage that you're receiving, so it improves the aggression of your own team while still having consistency. Seeing a big body that you don't really have to heal in the Fury, whereas the Frostguard is a little bit more squishy, still pretty tanky, but like more squishy than Fury. And then the final aggressive composition that's meta is Fury, Archmage, and Warden. Fury, again, buffing damage, very tanky. Archmage, very good at cleaving and really benefits from the Troubadour buff that the Fury brings, that mitigate or improves damage that people take. And then the Warden, again, just absolutely critical to be on your HungerDome team, to have a Warden. They're a switch hitter, they're very elusive, extremely tanky, and they do some of the most damage in the game. So your composition choices are typically sort of revolving around how you want to make use of your defensive utility character, and then the primary form of damage that you want to be making use of. So like if you think about Titan, if you think about Archmage, if you think about Alpha, each of these classes applies damage in a slightly different way. And they're finishing classes, and so they're designed to sort of like close the deal. Whereas the Warden, while it can finish players, it's much more of like a dot damage, sort of overwhelming source of damage, but it doesn't necessarily create kill opportunities on its own or finish on its own. It's really looking to have support from a secondary class. Those are the most common compositions. There are a couple of triple DPS compositions and things like that, but most of those have phased out of meta for teams that are looking to run a little bit more aggressively, to be able to kill people in the early to mid game as well as late game. But you're much more likely to run into something like that because it's just safer and still provides like pretty reasonable damage output. Triple DPS comps often fall victim to just dying because there's a little bit too much healing requirement needed to actually make them successful, or they're lacking some sort of critical buff or debuff that doesn't let them pierce through some of these more tanky compositions. There also are some cheese compositions that are very useful, and I say cheese not as a way to demean someone's strategy. Like, you should totally make use of these kinds of compositions if they fit your playstyle, or if they give you a better opportunity to win. The ECS tournaments format really benefits single game performance. And so these other compositions I'm talking about are more consistent. They are more likely to help you win more often, but you don't have to win often to win in this tournament. You just need to win 2 games. You need to win a wild card or a qualifier, and then you need to win the final or place highly in the final. And these cheese compositions can help you do that. So the main cheese compositions are Frostguard, Warden, Secutor. This one's a little less cheesy than the other ones I'm going to mention, but still relatively cheesy. Basically, you want to rely on the Secutor to push people out into the hunger in the late sort of circles, and you're very tanky otherwise, very difficult to kill as a DPS core. And basically with this composition early in the game, in the middle of the game, you kite, you run away, you scatter, you reseek your respawns, you kind of just do nothing early. Because you can't really win a field fight with this composition, but then it starts to really shine when space starts to get restricted and you can start pushing people into the hunger and mitigating the amount of risk you take on when you get third-partied in these smaller circles. Another cheese comp is the Secutor, Slayer, and Assassin. So this is what... I'm not actually sure which one it was. What was the name of their team? Imperium Belly, the one that placed second in Wildcard 2 here. Was it this team? Fuck. Which one was it? One of these teams. I don't know why I can't remember the guy's username. Anyway, one of these teams ran Secutor, Slayer, Assassin as their sort of like DPS composition. Basically just planning on hiding until the very end. They get as much gear as they can scavenge out, avoid all fights, and then wait to push people and then hide in the final circle and use their stealth characters to opportunely third party quickly and then get the hell out. This composition will get you to the final circle. In some cases, it will not win you the final circle. In most cases, I would say, because typically these aggressive teams will have an anti-stealth necklace at this point if they got lucky from the Griffin drops. In the case of Wildcard 1, oh, sorry, I was looking at Wildcard 2, that's why I couldn't find that player. Murderous Muddle, this one, they ran that particular composition. These folks would have lost if in our wildcard, if Clutch did not engage with us, because we had an anti-stealth necklace, and when we were engaged, we actually spotted some of the stealthers and we knew where the Warden was that was left over. So we actually would have placed top 2 had we not get interrupted and then like basically through the game. So like this strategy is really risky but it can get you to final circle. And if your Secutor and your healers don't die, you can actually participate fairly well, so long as there's enough other teams to kind of draw attention away from you. The third and much more rare but very interesting cheese composition is Secutor, Sanctifier, Frostguard. This composition does no significant damage. The Sanctifier can deal some damage, but mostly what you're relying on is multiple force pushes for the late game. So if you can live with your 3 tanky DPS and then your healers can stay alive, you might run something like an Arbiter and a Warden, or an Inquisitor and an Arbiter and a Inquisitor, or you might run a Inquisitor and a Paladin in that composition. Just be like super greedy with your healing and tankiness. You could do something like that and potentially live until you are in the very small circle and you're just pushing people all the time and doing tons of damage in a small area. It's not run very often, but it is an interesting composition and worthy of consideration. But basically, like, you want to pick the team that suits your strengths, what classes you're good at, and then what you think might be most useful in these lobbies here. Most of the teams that were in Wildcard 2, which is again the focus of our video today, ultimately chose 1 tank, 2 DPS. There was no triple DPS really. There were very few cheesy comps, honestly. Like there were some Secutors that were slotted in there in a tank slot, and provided some pushing and usefulness in the late game, and ended up being really important actually in getting House of Ari to the end. But I wouldn't necessarily consider that cheesing. It was just more like defensive and just kind of like a slot in that you can put in. So most of the I think everybody in this lobby understood that and picked teams that would get them to that more tanky sort of final circle, not necessarily full on aggression teams. Having a Titan, things like that, can give you the opportunity to kill things, and you can make that choice. Most of these teams were playing for the final circle. Finally, what I want to talk about is just like hunger looting patterns and pros and cons of things that people do. I'm going to do 2 things. I'm just going to show you an example of a route through my own POV from a HungerDome that we did a couple weeks ago, and then we're going to go into the actual VOD of the video and go through it. All right. Okay, so let's get started looking at all this stuff. Basically, hunger looting patterns are very personal to many different teams. Folks decide to do multiple different things, but I think there's a couple that are very efficient, and it depends on lobby size. So if your lobby is less full, you can spread out and loot more hunger circles. I think it's almost always a mistake to farm in the very beginning of the game. You want to rush to get these boxes because they have the most useful stuff. Depending on what location you spawn at, you have a couple different options of how you loot. In this game, we spawned on a corner, and what that corner means is that we have access to this bank with only 1 team that can potentially get to it. And then we have access to a secondary close hunger, which I will eventually go loot to here now. My team is also spawned off to the north to go take a look at our regular hunger that we can get to. But this second hunger is more close to the middle of the map, and actually is advantage towards us to get to. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to loot 2 hungers. This is super normal for most people to do. They'll look to sort of like split and get there. I'm actually I thought it was bailing. I actually didn't listen to the comms in this before I pulled it up. I just noticed that I did the looting structure I was looking for, but I'm going to loot all this hunger. Hopefully I noticed that box that was behind me. I did. Cool. I'm identifying the items I have, and I'm going to go hand all the loot out. It's important to think about this kind of looting pattern, the kind of looting patterns that you want to do. If you're, in our case, we're fairly confident that our 4-man can take, or at least survive, against most 4-player, or against most 5-player teams, except for the most aggressive and strong teams will bail against those folks. But we're fairly confident that we can take on those teams, and so we're more willing to spend more time seeking out hunger and getting that than potentially some other teams might be. We're also not waiting. We're not like going to get extra hungers. We're just getting the couple that are close to us, capping our fort to guarantee our respawn in a couple minutes, or to alert us to teams who are playing in the back and kind of like sneaking around near us. And then we're going to immediately transition into Griffin. I'm not going to show the rest of this just so we can get into the actual wildcard that we're trying to analyze. But basically, the reason that we picked all these routing is that we wanted to make sure that we have a pretty good amount of loot, and that we're able to use this vendor at this fort to fill in any slots that we're missing. We're trying to be quick to get to the Griffin, which is a very big power spike. The jewelry that you can get from that and the legendary weapons that you typically get from that can be very useful. And then it also gives us an opportunity to intercept similar teams who are also playing aggressively, to better like near the Griffin and then try to fight them. There's another popular strategy which we're going to get to, and we actually see in the VOD, which I will start now, where folks basically rush straight to the Griffin. So this is Vanguard White. We'll be following a lot in the VOD that they went over, but Vanguard White has a little bit of a different strategy. Vanguard White goes straight to all five to their hunger. They then all five loot the bank, and then they go straight to that Griffin. So they don't split up at all. And the reason they don't split up at all is that they're trying very quickly to get to the Griffin and kill it uncontested, because they know that they can get good gear and useful stuff, and then they can potentially go back and loot other hungers, or use the stuff that they got to get there. They don't need to spend a lot of time looting these extra things. And so the advantage of this is that if you get there and the other teams that you're playing against are slower, they won't be able to stop you from getting that Griffin, and you'll have your gear, and you'll be at like relatively similar levels of gear to somebody who spent the time that we did to go loot stuff. And so, yeah, they're splitting it a little bit here just to get a couple of pieces of loot, but they're all making progress towards the Griffin. They're rushing that thing. If you make this choice, you have to be very confident in your ability to kill this thing quickly, because the timing difference between rushing Griffin and spending time looting, unless those teams get into a fight, is very different, or very minimal. They'll reach this Griffin roughly a minute and a half, maybe, before another team would, assuming that they don't get hung up on any looting or anything like this. They're very quick. They'll be there about a minute early, but typically, in our case, when we intercept teams who rush Griffin, we're typically better geared, and we normally reach them prior to the Griffin being killed. I'm gonna be mostly fast forwarding through the first couple seasons, because the pace of this game is not super fast. There's not like, yeah, so we have another Griffin rushing team here over here. So if you want to like use this as an example, I'm just gonna pause the video real quick. The Winterblades team is Flat Assembly is on their vendor right now. Vendor is about a 60-second run to any given Griffin that you might be near. These guys are a little bit slower than Vanguard White, but they're only a quarter way into the Griffin. This Griffin's gonna last for another minute or so, 2 minutes, maybe not. But basically, if Flat Assembly was fast and they were near this spot, they would be able to reach this Griffin before it's killed, which would give them a huge advantage in the fight, because they're more geared at this point than LOD would be. But it doesn't happen, and LOD's risk pays off. They kill this Griffin and get all these hunger loot boxes and stuff. They get all these chests and stuff, and they're totally fine. They can then go back to other hungers. They can go capture themselves a fort and ensure their respawn. They basically have a lot of choices here that they can make, but they get this Griffin uncontested. So there's pros and cons to both, which is super good. Okay, so all of this talk about like loot patterns and compositions and things like that all kind of feed into the topic of dictating pace. How fast do you want to play? How aggressively do you want to play? How willing are you to wait for things to come your way or opportunities to show up? And in this particular lobby, most teams are fairly patient. They're not seeking out useless fights. They're not spending a ton of time doing nothing. They're going from objective to objective and looking for important stuff. Okay, so here's Vanguard White versus Winterblades. So this is the exact situation I was referring to. So the Griffin's dead, but they're fighting in the Griffin area. So I assume that the action just caught them just as the Griffin died. If the Winterblades team was a little faster on their buy, they might have actually reached this team while they were fighting the Griffin and killed them. And now we got this like big crazy three-way wave. Vanguard has gear from the Griffin, but most of them are not fully equipped. So you see Dark Silver here has no chest piece. there's like their various pieces of gear are missing, but they're the strongest team on the map, and so they're willing to take these fights because they know that they can win. And it's unfortunate for the Flawed Assembly team that they kind of get wiped, but they don't completely die out, and they have a respawn here. But these, like, I think this is the geriatric guys. They also run into this fight. It seems like they're probably pretty new players that I haven't seen them before, like any of these usernames before. So I'm sure they played in some like random qualifier, but they're not really competitive, and so Vanguard doesn't respect them and just goes in and murders their asses, getting themselves an early hunger kill. Super useful. We're just gonna skip ahead. They just wipe them out. Very easy. But like, again, this is like all about dictating pace, right? So now they've gotten a bunch of gear that they looted from all those people to fill in their slots. These other teams are spending time out in the forts. Looks like KDS is either trying to, I think the Praise the Main is their actual team name, but they're trying to flip this respawn and maybe try to grief some of these teams who are getting only forts, get it for themselves. I can't see the map obviously, but I think they have their own respawn that's uncontested right now, so they're willing to take a risk at trying to clear out some of these forts and get eliminations done a little bit earlier. Something that folks who are calling these fights don't necessarily do is that, like, Crowfall is not really so much about like who's being focused or any of that kind of a thing. It's a lot about like how defensive and offensive cooldowns are used in your given team, in your given team composition, for you to be able to notice what's important about a fight. And so most of these teams are running Inquisitor, Arbiter. Some of them are running Paladin, Arbiter, or the Paladin Inquisitor. But most of these teams, like, their healing output is like consistent high output from one class, like the Inquisitor or Paladin, who's like very point based but has very high healing in the points that they're defending. And then a couple like meaningful alts. Arbiter is much more of like a consistent, constant healer that has a ton of like little hots going out there and stuff with one big heal. And so with that, in that situation, it's important to recognize when those major cooldowns are spent. So if you see a Cleric alt, if you see a Confessor alt, that kind of a thing, that's when you know that defensive cooldowns are being spent and things can start getting spicy and there's chances for people to die. Offensive cooldowns are a lot harder to view as a spectator because most of these classes are constantly dealing damage. There's only a couple that have clear signals. Like things like an Alpha Warrior doing a clap is very clear that they're dealing a lot of damage. But most of these other classes, like Archmage, for example, or Titan, are just constantly dishing out damage. So it's more important to look for defensive cooldowns. So in this case, in this particular fight, the Unparalleled guys, they just kind of, like, most of their defensive cooldowns are spent at this point. You saw the Cleric ult and then he died right afterward. Everybody on Vanguard is totally healthy, and so they're able to be very aggressive. And so this fight's like basically a wash. Like, it's like totally free for Vanguard. I would spend more time analyzing the fights, but I don't think you guys need to see that. I just want to mostly spend time looking at the strategy. So the first two seasons in HungerDome are not super important for most of the time. 9 of 10 teams stay alive throughout the entire summer, spring and summer of this particular game. And the reason they stay alive is that it's very easy for people to split up when a fight goes wrong. Like, if you lose one member, all 4 people can split into different directions, and it's very difficult for a team to chase you down in that situation without wasting time or subjecting themselves to potentially getting third party. And so one person lives and forts are still available. You can't really kill them because they almost always will be able to get to a fort that's nobody there and be able to flip it and get respawns done. I think this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the setup that affected Vanguard, who I think played the best in this qualifier, but played very well. Didn't actually make any significant mistakes, just kind of got hungered at the end. Vanguard is running a very interesting comp. They have an Inquisitor, they have a Paladin on Harzu, and then they have Frostguard, Titan, Warden, which is like super normal. Let's talk a little bit about their composition. So Inquisitor is a very stable, large group healer. All of their heals, except for Hellfire Aura and Tornadoes, and even Tornadoes can be considered a group heal, affect their entire party, and they're extremely efficient. They heal like most of your health bar. Like a fully channeled fervor is like 4 to 5k HP. A Fire of Life can be 4 to 5k HP depending on your gear and how much it bursts for. It's very, very large, consistent healing that'll keep your team alive. Harzu is playing a Paladin, so it's very point defense oriented, very large amount of healing. If you're standing in the fight and you're kind of like balled up and participating there, which was what this group wants to do. They're very good in the scrap, and they're very good in final circle. So they're kind of leaning into being strong in their point and strong at like defending against their parties and things like that because of all this massive amount of healing that they're putting out and the tankiness of the classes that they're playing with. Where they kind of like, there's a bit of a weakness in their composition as well though, because Harzu is playing this Templar, and they might disagree with this, by the way, and that's totally fine. They're lacking an Arbiter in their composition, which is a very normal pairing with a Frostguard. And the reason is that they have a spell called Shrink, which basically is an AoE spell that you can apply to the enemy that reduces their damage that they deal by 20%. Shrink can stack up to 3 times, and it also stacks with a crippling ice debuff that the Frostguard puts out, which basically means that you can take your opponent or the enemy team and you can reduce the amount of damage they deal quite significantly. Those two classes comboing together on really threatening DPS like a Titan or something like that can basically make them do 0 damage. And so if you're hitting your shrinks, if you're kind of like spamming that particular composition, it's really hard for you to get a damage advantage on this team if they're playing correctly. So they kind of lost that, but in favor of getting a more tanky secondary healer that's hard to focus and that heals more than an Arbiter does in the environment that they're useful in. So kind of pros and cons. I like their composition. I might have preferred personally the Arbiter myself, but like this is like, totally reasonable, totally fine. Okay, I think I was talking a little bit about spring and summer, then I completely got on a tangent. These guys go try to hunt people at forts. That's a good idea. They might be able to get lucky and get a full limb. They chase these folks down. It doesn't work. They run out. Like they're not going to eliminate this team. They're still alive. They're still able to get a respawn. I didn't really like how much they followed Vanguard in this scenario. Like, yeah, they're seeing them grief some folks, and there might not be any other fights going on, so it's probably reasonable. But as a tournament competitor, it's very annoying because there's very little stream delay going on these streams, and so everybody in the lobby, maybe not everybody, like I'm sure some folks were honest, but most teams know where Vanguard is, and there's no like anti-stream sniping thing that they can do, right? Like you can't catch somebody doing it, and they'll never admit to it if they did it. So yeah, basically like chasing this guy down, they're hopeful that they'll get a full limb, but they don't because they have another respawn, and their team's delta split, so that was actually just a total waste of time. It's fun to do that thing, it's fun to chase them, but you need to press your map key and you need to look and make sure. So they actually wasted time doing this. I don't know if there's another team that they could have possibly eliminated, but we're kind of like, this is another thing about like strategy and timing, right? So I'm just gonna go back a bit. So when they started this chase, it was the end of summer. Summer ends at 20 minutes on the clock, leaving 20 minutes left for the rest of the game. I guess technically 19 minutes 30 seconds or something for the final collapse. The beginning of fall is really important because that's when you have the opportunity into the castle, and the castle is really what allows teams to start getting eliminated and start like actually power spiking. And so they might have made this decision because their gear is all really good, based off of the Griffin loot that they got and the other kills and loots that they received. But many teams in this particular qualifier did not enter the castle at fall. The advantage to entering the castle at fall is that it allows you to buy legendary gear from a vendor and ensure that you have a power advantage against most teams in the lobby. So having gold, being farmed up, getting to that vendor early kind of like improves the average damage that you're dealing by a pretty significant margin. The difference between a legendary weapon and a purple weapon is roughly 10 damage on the value, and then they have much better secondary stats if you can get them. You can also get to a legendary chest piece, which is much more rare to receive in the early game, which you can get a beneficial damage bonus on that too. So it really spikes your damage and makes you stronger. Armor values and stuff like that is a lot better. There's also epic vendors in there too that can improve some of the pieces of gear that might be worse on your character, and it's a really large power spike. And so any time that you spend out here doing stuff like this that doesn't really benefit you, other than you had a chance at eliminating this team, but really didn't happen because one of their players got away and ended up capping a fort or a keep later and living. You're basically having an opportunity cost where you're letting another team potentially get stronger than you earlier. Fortunately for Vanguard, the rest of the lobby is also fucking around. KDS and HOA are fighting here. There's a third party here from the Winterblade's team. Nobody's that interested in getting into the castle. I think that's a pretty big mistake. You could be getting much stronger than your opponents and giving yourself a better opportunity to win, but these guys want to play outside the castle. They don't want to focus themselves in since all this lobby is interested in hiding out and taking their time before putting themselves in an enclosed space. They end up running into each other, which is the opposite, I think, of what they wanted to really do. So they take this fight. The fight is going, it's relatively even at this point, but you can notice at this point here, a couple things have happened. So firstly, Yoink on the Alpha Warrior is at half HP and has taken a lot of extra damage and hasn't really gained space for himself, while his healer Dredden is also at half HP and in a relatively rough position, while the rest of the team is all stacked. HOA is sort of stacked, but they're a little bit more split up. Now they're pretty stacked too. But basically what this situation, what this causes in this situation is it forces Dredden to ult, and they're not able to really recover Yoink either. They don't really have enough healing, it looks like. There's a lot of problems with their stack. And so in that exact moment, they ran out of defensive cooldowns and they weren't positioned well to kind of handle an escape or back off. The call wasn't made, it seems. And so they just kind of die to the burst that comes out from the Titan. Alpha Warrior compositions really rely on using timings for their damage. When Neckbreaker is available, when someone gets stunned or knocked down, when there's multiple people stacked up, there's a debuff or whatever going on. They really want to make sure that they have something that's ramping their damage or something that makes their damage as efficient as possible for when they press their buttons. And so if you don't get maximum value and scare the enemy team when you use your spells for the first couple of times, it's really hard for that team to kind of get back into it. So they have to play a little bit more defensively. Where if you compare it to a Titan doesn't really have a burst window in the same way. They have a ramp up time. Usually the first berserk that they use, they spend time whirlwinding or basic attacking to gain Titan stacks, but then after that fact, their damage is consistently high throughout the rest of the fight. And so while they're not really relying on burst timing windows in the same way. And so that's why many of these teams are playing Titans. They have a lot of ways to mitigate their crash, and they're not exactly as risky as an Alpha Warrior might be. While they do less damage than an Alpha Warrior overall, they have higher burst and higher consistent damage. And so it kind of makes it so you have less to play around, even though Berserk is a tougher mechanic. Anyway. So these teams are getting in their keeps. They're kind of spending all this time outside of the castle, whereas Vanguard recognizes that this is a great opportunity for them to get an advantage on their gear. They do end up finding this random team and kind of hurting them a bit. I think he dies but doesn't get bullet. Yeah, he just dies. So their team's still alive. They get a little bit of an advantage here from killing this, but they have guards on them now, so their buy's a little bit weird, but they end up getting it off anyway. So let's talk a little bit about castle meta. There's been some developments recently. We used to really value capping the castle and holding it so folks couldn't respawn. But recently teams have been valuing the castle location. So these vendors and getting this gear up. But really they don't want to fully cap the castle, because basically what it does is if you fully cap the castle and then you leave or look away or get caught in a fight or whatever, it gives an opportunity for solo players to capture the castle from behind you and then get their team rezzed. You don't want to do that anymore. It's a bad idea. So what's better is that aggressive teams have been getting their buy, holding areas near the castle or pushing out into the walls to kill teams that are hiding or playing around like this right now, third-party opportunities, etc. for these teams that are playing a little bit more passively, and killing them off. And then when their stragglers run away, which they inevitably will do, it's very difficult for those stragglers to capture that castle unless some other team came in and captured the castle after the fact. If you're playing on an aggressive team, it's like semi-likely that they'll go cap the castle, but one of those aggressive teams will also probably not leave the castle once they've capped it. They want to hold it and prevent people from respawning. So this HOA fight's kind of weird. They're fighting on top of this like orange team, I think Valeria, yeah. Their keep. It's the North Keep, so they have really long amounts of time to respawn, but they're basically just farming these guys for basically no reason. They can't go up and cap the castle, so this fight at this point is now actually a waste of time. In roughly 30 seconds, it won't be a waste of time, 40 seconds, because the hunger will overtake that respawn point, so they might be able to get a couple final kills and break this team. But I think they end up like leaving them at some point soon, and then like this team ends up either not fully respawning, but they don't actually full limb them, so it's kind of rough. It would have been better if they took the fight like now, when that respawn was ending, versus letting them just kind of chain respawn and split up and end up regrouping. Like even that player that they just killed now, I'm fairly certain is able to respawn. Let me just check the player account real quick. So 39, yeah, that guy respawned. It could have been potentially somebody else respawning, but I'm fairly certain it was that guy who respawned. So that fight wasn't ultimately worth it for them. Okay, so we're at the point now in the castle where folks are, the respawns are mostly gone. The secondary respawns are mostly gone, so most players are on their last life. The castle is up for grabs. I think it's 3 of 6 right now, so somebody's in there killing some of the guards, so that respawn might become available shortly for people who are broken and their teams that are broken. But teams are trying to position themselves now to set themselves up for the final circle. And so this is a really good fight for Vanguard to take. They push really aggressively into Yanni's team, who has a very similar composition. They're very much about surviving and playing defensively. They have a Titan as well, trying to kill individual players. They're running an Arbiter, which is a little bit different than what the opponent team's doing, but basically this LOD team is able to reduce damage that they're receiving quite high and deal comparable damage to Vanguard. Vanguard, I would give them the skill edge, and so there's a chance that they could get picks, but LOD is just kiting them constantly. And when you're getting kited constantly and you have a Paladin as a healer, it feels really bad. And like you'll notice that there's another team that shows up behind them. There's another team in that wall over there. Vanguard can see this stuff, and every single team here needs to make a choice, because this is going to be a clusterfuck here in a second. Vanguard decides to loop around the edge. LOD goes up the hill, and so all 3 teams, I think, end up disengaging. There's like a couple random 2 players up here that are kind of just hanging out. Can't cap the castle, but they all disengage. As a spectator, this looks like shit, but as a player, this is 100% the right idea, because you never know who's going to be the third-party target. And normally teams, when they third-party, they're trying to break a team, an individual team, and either fully kill them or like make them less impactful. So if you lose a player, it's really a really big deal. So you can like kill one player on one team that you're third partying and then switch the other team. And so it's really just important for everybody just to break off of that thing, because you're creating a big risk. I think this is a situation where Vanguard fucked up. I think they should have pushed this team that's stuck on the hunger. They know that they're a lot stronger. They've already fought this team once, and they can kill them. But they spent all this time hanging out up here, maybe worried about getting third party themselves. They don't have perfect information like a Flying Crow does. But it would have been... And they also have this castle guard that they're kind of like griefing by holding out here. I think that might be one of the actual guards from inside the castle. They end up hopping down and killing one of these players, but they could have killed that whole team and gotten themselves a hunger buff if they were aggressive in the first place. I'm fairly certain, yeah, the other two get away. So they don't even finish this team. Just a missed opportunity for very little positional advantage due to the hunger. When winter starts, most teams are spending at least a couple seconds figuring out where exactly the circle is going. The spectator doesn't really do this, but you can look up into the sky and see where the sort of big glowing ball is. And which direction it's going. You can also look on the ground itself, and there's like a little circle that kind of goes underneath of it, and that'll tell you where the circle is ending. In this case, we have a tree circle final, which is like fairly good. It's a kind of like a straight up fight. There's very little places to hide, but there are places for solos to make plays where they can basically keep themselves covered and alive. Very good fighting circle. In this case, we have another third party situation, so all the teams are confined. So this is where you have the best opportunity to actually fully eliminate teams, and this is where you want to really like take advantage of that. HOA played this section of this qualifier very well. They're almost always second to a fight, or third to a fight rather. Almost never picking it straight up. Sometimes they would pick a straight up fight, but most of the time they're spending their time disengaging, picking a third-party fight, and then running away, which is like a really good idea because in this case, because they disengage from Winterblades, and Winterblades is also scared of taking a fight against HOA and Vanguard, they're able to kind of split, and then Vanguard isn't able to completely commit to HOA because there's a looming Winterblades team nearby, and so nobody wants to get third-partied, and so HOA ends up taking the correct timing to go break this YBR team, and I think they end up getting a final kill here on one of these players. We'll see. Basically, the circle's coming to a close at this point, and so there's a lot of like risk and kind of risk evaluation that each of these teams are doing. So let's pause for a second. There are 30 teams, or 30 players alive, 9 teams available on the map right now, and so every team is a team of 5. And so that math does not line up. There's not 9 full teams available. So you have to figure out exactly how many teams are likely available, and then basically like subtract from there. So it's not guaranteed that there'll be full teams at this point, but you have to kind of do that math. And so you know that there's a potential for 6 full teams to be alive. There isn't, and so it's more likely that there's something like 4 to 5 full teams available, and then a couple broken teams with just a few different members. Okay, so now we're getting into this posturing position. So okay, so this is where teams like Celine's team with the Secutor, and Vanguard's team, as well as KDS's team composition start to kind of come into play here. There are decisions to be more defensive, secretive sort of compositions that are a little bit more able to be tanky and sort of survive and weather the storm of third parties comes into play and kind of gives them an advantage here. So now these solo players, since the solo players have a big issue in these final circles when there's so many players remaining, because there's no space for them to hide. It's very difficult for you to live in this scenario. But now everybody has to kind of push into the middle here. When everybody's in the middle, now teams have to make important decisions about who they're fighting, when they're fighting, and why they're fighting. At this point, every team has had an opportunity to see basically every other team and what composition that they're running, and so they can make educated choices about who they fight and when they fight. You'll see LOD is a little bit more aggressive. HOA spends most of their time in the circle trying to not be caught and not be fighting. That benefits them because they have force push in the final circle. Winter Blades is playing an aggressive composition, but isn't actually playing that aggressively. They're kind of waiting to third party a little bit. That's okay. That's a player choice. I think that kind of doesn't benefit them because some of these other teams are willing to push into them a bit, and since they're a little bit more hesitant to take a fight in the final circle, they end up getting third party a lot more often. So you'll see HOA here is like posturing ready to third party. I think they start poking with the Warden and the Titan here in a second. Their HOA is very concerned about getting pinched as well. So it's like, but they're in like the best position here, right? So they get a pull. They have nobody behind them, so they have that advantage. They're pushed W into the back line here. W has already spent a lot of their defensive cooldowns at this point because of the initial engage with KDS, and so HOA is able to clean up, I think, a member here. Yeah, they're left with 3 on W, but they're in a pretty rough spot. LOD also makes some good moves here. They were pinched between 2 teams, but they immediately recognized that there's space available in the Northeast, and so they immediately rotate and decide to take on the Vanguard team. Their team is very defensive in how they play. They're almost always kite. They have lots of shrinks, lots of CC. So they're playing this very well, able to kite away and kind of put themselves in the position. And so now we have to think about kill teams and their mindset. So now you're on Vanguard. Vanguard is the most aggressive team in the map by far. They try to kill as many people as possible. They have probably the best gear on the map right now, but they didn't really camp the castle itself for super long. But I would expect that they have the strongest gear right now. They're also very good in this circle, so they got to be feeling pretty good about this. The only problem is that when there's 6 teams remaining and there's 24 players on the map, that means that you have roughly 4 full teams to contest with, and regardless of how good your gear is, if you get targeted by 2 or 3 teams because they know you're the strongest team on the map, you're going to die, which is brutal, and they end up ultimately avoiding that pitfall. But it also kind of puts you in a situation where you're leaving it up to chance almost how you survive in the end. So Vanguard's in a really difficult spot because they can kill any of these people. They probably want to try to poke Winter Blades because they see that they have 2. They want to try to third party LOD here a little bit since HOA is involved, but HOA is just like unwilling to put themselves in a position where they could be potentially third party too. The HOA ends up getting a final elimination on the team there, which is excellent for them, getting more that hunger debuff. There are 5 total hunger stacks available, or I think it's God's Favor is what it's called. So these teams kind of like, it's fairly evenly distributed on who has the advantage in the hunger itself at this point, but this is still like third-party city, right? LOD gets in some trouble. We have this situation here where Harzu and Corosius are pushing on this side. They were on their own for a moment there. The whole team wasn't really facing them. And then we have KDS and HOA kind of just hanging out here on the side. KDS, and then they kind of like then have to spend their movement in Vanguard to rotate to this other side to KDS where they had a chance to kill. But HOA is just like chilling in their stack, right? Like Vanguard's trying to create a situation where it's chaotic for some of these teams to like be mixed up and fighting and giving them an opportunity to use their superior damage and shot calling, like their fight potential basically, to get picks and to like win these fights. But HOA, KDS, and LOD are all just stacked on themselves. Like you see how like these teams are grouped up? They're just totally unwilling to mix into one another. And so when they're unwilling to mix into one another, it makes it much easier for them to play defensively. And if a team like Vanguard goes into their team, it makes it much easier for another team to go third party that group. So if they all kind of just stay balled together and passive, it's very difficult for someone to create a situation where there's actual threatening fights happening in this exact moment. So everybody's just like holding their zone. KDS lives here, HOA lives here, LOD lives here. I mean, Winter Blades can die in this spot. Like they're just a 3-piece. KDS pushes LOD because they see an opportunity. So now we're getting into a little bit of a mix. Vanguard tries to push HOA. HOA is probably the tankiest team on the map right now. They almost get a kill. This would be very different if Mars just actually died in that exact moment. I really don't like that they went to this perspective because I can't see anything. But they had a chance here to end this team. They didn't. HOA weathers the storm. They have healing cooldowns. They haven't been fighting that much, so they're safe at this moment. And now we have 1 minute and 13 seconds left. Okay, so let's think about defensive cooldowns that folks just spent. At 1 minute and 13, the final collapse happens at 30 seconds remaining on the clock. Most of HOA's defensive cooldowns were spent like roughly 10 seconds ago, 20 seconds ago. And so they have the time to regenerate those defensive cooldowns. So long as they stay alive for the next 45 seconds or so, they're going to have all of their buttons available to be able to handle the final collapse. KDS did just fight, but they were taking a third party, sort of like they were crashing into LOD as they were fighting with Winterblades. And so they didn't necessarily have to spend as many cooldowns in this exact moment. Vanguard has been desperately trying to fight people, but they also are like very healthy. I didn't notice any significant cooldowns up to this point. We could go like frame by frame to see what they spent, but the camera work didn't really do it for me for that. But I expect that they're very strong right now. I'm feeling very safe. W, again, just hanging out here. HOA does not target them. I understand, like this, like to a casual observer, this might look a little bit sketch that these two like longtime allies aren't looking at each other, but every single time this kind of thing happens, if you're HOA in this scenario and you target W, you're just gonna die to Vanguard. Like 100%, they're gonna kill you if you look at them. Damebix and Yoink can do some damage. They're pretty scary, but they themselves are also trying to make it to final circle. Like they're trying to make it to the end here, and so they're not willing to necessarily throw their bodies on the line to hurt HOA or any of these teams really, and risk their chance of winning. They're like in a really rough spot here. They could try to influence it and like accept their loss, but they're not looking to do that, right? So like that would be dumb. So here's another situation again. Mars just at half HP. If Vanguard killed this guy, HOA is in a much worse spot because they might not be able to survive in this for this next 30 seconds with all the spam that's going on. But this is like hell on earth for a competitive team that's trying to set themselves up for a huge advantage. Count how many players are in here. There's 22 players. 22. 4 full teams, and then like a couple Winterblades here. I think one of these teams might have 4 players. Yeah, LOD has 4 players. Like, this is nightmare territory, right? This is a roll of a dice. This is why they implemented the like eliminating team gives you a buff, because if you're more aggressive in this moment, you could win, because this is gonna collapse no matter what happens. Like nobody here can make a play so big that it makes it so that you can guarantee who wins. This hunger is gonna collapse. So now we're at the point where people who are running secutors and things like that of that nature are like highly advantaged. I'd also put the Vanguard, again, the team who's been most aggressive, who has the most eliminations, etc., in a very good spot here. It just doesn't really play out like that for them in the end. So I want to remind everybody about, okay, so Mars just almost dies. If Vanguard had been looking at HOA, and I understand why they're not, because KDS is a 5-man group, they're all together, like they're kind of like walking this way. If they were looking to the right, they could have killed Mars just here, and this game's totally different. Mars just gets saved, like he's just able to hang out. He's not getting focused. Everybody is in this big fucking stack. Some people are getting pushed. We get like a little bit of a knockback here. This is where clerics switching to offensive ults and knocking people out of the circle starts to be really valuable. But it's at 46 seconds remaining. We have 15 seconds until the final collapse. This is a clusterfuck. This is where Alpha Warriors, Titans, like any sort of Templar, the Frost Guard itself, very useful in these scenarios because they can spam the hell out of people and get them CC'd. And nobody plays well in this scenario, especially during a wildcard game where stresses are a lot higher. Now, nobody plays this coherently. Folks will like run this thing through and they'll go step by step and like try to see like what cooldowns and stuff like that were used. Like everybody's just spamming every fucking thing they have because they could die at any moment to like anything. And so the clerics like March Just, who I know does this very often, like anybody who's like running these force pushes and stuff like that are the ones that are gonna like, look how low he is again for the third time. This game is totally different if this guy doesn't live. But he does, he lives. Heals on Yanni, LOD gets eliminated by Flawed Assembly. So Damebix or Yoink or somebody gets that kill here. If another team like Vanguard or HOA or KDS gets this kill, this Hunger could be totally different. They're spinning. Damebix dies. HOA gets another kill, so this gives them another advantage to the final seconds that they're getting. Vanguard is relatively healthy. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so Vanguard's relatively healthy at this point. So let's just really quickly, let's look. So there's the Zelina Serpents. Some of them are on the edge. I think they might have just got pushed a little bit or bounced out a little bit here. But like they're totally fine, right? Like they're safe. HOA has pretty good HP bars as well right now. KDS also has decent HP bars, but Vanguard's like fine. They didn't get those final kills that they needed, like in that exact moment that might have benefited them or helped them survive, but they're totally fine. But what ends up happening is that these cheesy sort of push compositions where they made the choice to not run an Arbiter themselves, as a reminder. They wanted to run the Templar for this exact scenario where things get small and they have a lot of HP and a lot of healing. They just get abused by pushes. So Marsh just hits an offensive ult to knock them out, and Solian hits a force push right here. So he sucks them in, force pushes. The only people that get force pushed, and this is extremely annoying for Vanguard, are it's just their Warden that gets in here. And the Warden is a tanky character, like I'll give you that, but they're not as tanky as everybody else who just got pushed. Like Saitando really needed to live in there. Harzu needed to get a couple extra healing ticks before it ended, but now it's just like total chaos. Kurossi has died somewhere in that kind of like exchange, but now like Dark Silver's still like fairly healthy, but he was like just on his own, being hit by a Titan and all these other characters. HOA is fine. Titan in Final Circle is really good if they can get like start a fresh Berserk just and be like relatively topped as the Hunger collapses, because the difference in damage in this moment actually has nothing to do with the Hunger. Well, I mean, the Hunger buffs obviously benefit you. They'll reduce the amount of damage you're taking, but it has everything to do with how much damage you are dealing to other players. And so these tanky compositions win by getting you into the Hunger earlier, because the Hunger deals more damage than any other player can do as quickly. It's like several thousand damage, like usually about 1,000 damage a second, which is more than players can do normally without like being on like a target dummy or multiple target dummies or something. So it's the Hunger damage plus whatever the players are doing. So a Titan doesn't take any damage from the players. They just kind of like instantly mitigate the player damage. They just don't heal back the Hunger damage that they're receiving here. And so Staff is just like unloading on, and I'm fairly certain Staff had excellent target priority here. Like I think Corosius, you see Corosius, he's just dying in the middle because Staff is just hitting Corosius. He's prioritizing the scarier players. They got, I think, 2 Hunger kills, like 2 eliminations there in the very end, which bought them enough time to beat this KDS team. And it was like literally as close as it could have possibly gotten, like fairly RNG heavy here. Like, but HOA played it well. They got their knocks off. They were the only team that was running a push comp in a very passive lobby. And like they envisioned themselves being able to make it to this point. The 4 teams that were the strongest in the lobby all made it to the very end, and it was just a matter of like who handled the Hunger collapse better, because all these teams are playing very passively, very defensively. So it wasn't about who could kill better, it was about who could survive better, and HOA just did it better. They had the Secutor, they had the Arbiter push, they played very defensively. They had the ability to third party correctly when they needed to. Like, I think they actually played like a legitimate game. I think a lot of people are sleeping on them. Vanguard played very well as well. It could have gone, honestly, it could have gone any other way. If Mars just had died earlier, this entire match is like completely different. I think Vanguard wins in that scenario. If staff crashed at all, like there's like so many things that could have possibly happened to make things different. But the entire setup for this final circle event is entirely based on pregame preparation. These folks read the lobby correctly. They knew what teams were in the wild card and how at risk they would be to just dying to aggressive teams. So they picked more defensive lineups. And I think every team did this. Just some of them had more tools available in the very final circle. They recognized their strengths and weaknesses. They didn't pick fights that they shouldn't be taking. They had really well-made comps. They played their strategy correctly, their early movement. Some folks took fights that I may agree with or disagree with, but that's just kind of how the HungerDome goes. Sometimes you get stuck into a fight. It's all good. All that matters is that when the chips are down, can you keep it together and can you do what your team's designed to do in the final circle? And HOA and KDS did that. I think Vanguard did that too. They could have definitely placed first or second or anywhere in this particular match, and they could have won. The W team could have also done better if they didn't lose in that initial fight. They kind of just got the short end of the stick and got third partied and ran out of cooldowns. But otherwise, this is a very good match. I'm excited to see what will happen in the third wildcard and see how everybody improves and learns from these. I think it'll be very similar to wildcard 2. So wildcard 1 was very aggressive, but wildcard 3 will be slightly less aggressive. And depending on who makes it out of this, we're going to have a very interesting final, because the majority of the finals teams are... So there's a couple teams that won that were good. And that made some good plays in the earlier qualifiers, but most of the like serious teams did not want to risk losing their wildcard spot to reapply to a qualifier. They would have probably would have made it, but like that's a tournament formatting problem. I could make an entire video up talking about that, but like holy shit. Yeah. Most of the aggressive teams, the teams that win a lot of HungerDomes and have played really well in these things, are in the wild cards. Vanguard Black, Vanguard White, Clutch, the CG Devils team. Like this lobby had like most of the like aggressive NA teams and then one aggressive EU team. Most of the teams that are going to make it into the finals are more passive, slower teams. And again, I'm not trying to talk shit about anybody. Like play the format the correct way. And these teams are capable of taking fights and are winning them in a lot of cases, but they're not at the same level of aggression as these other teams. And so it's very likely that we'll see another sort of slow match like we did in Wildcard 2 in these next two significant games. And I hope teams are preparing for that type of eventuality. Maybe we'll see different. Maybe I'll be surprised and we'll see some sort of major like aggressive upset and have some kind of really exciting game. But yeah, that's just my analysis on it. Let me know if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, if you have different takes, or if you think some of my takes were bad. Happy to discuss about it. I think the ECS in general and HungerDome in general has been very positive for Crowfall. We can make some comments about what if the MMO has suffered from it. There's like a lot of things we can kind of say about the effect that this tournament has had on the video game in general, but I think like it's accomplished its purpose. It's brought attention to the game. It's an easy way for you to go get some PvP, like a more casual game mode for the actual sort of live servers that play it on. But this tournament's been fun. Like even though our team lost, the entire process of the qualifiers and these wildcard games and preparing and practicing and all that stuff has been really good. So I'm excited to see how it turns out and if we have another one of these in the future and how the game goes. Yeah. Cool. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.